By late March, the American foothold east of the Rhine had expanded into a full front. More than 300,000 Allied troops had crossed through various points. The German Western armies, already mauled in the Ruhr and Eifel regions, were disintegrating. Desertion spiked. Whole units vanished into the forests or surrendered en masse. For civilians, the end felt near but uncertain. Refugees clogged the roads, fleeing from both the West and the advancing Soviets in the East. Cities burned nightly under Allied bombings. The Rhine, once a lifeline of German commerce and culture, had become a graveyard of iron and fire. In those chaotic weeks after Reimagining, it became clear. Germany was no longer defending a nation. It was surviving a collapse, and the collapse was only accelerating. The fall of the Ludendorff Bridge was not just an engineering failure or a tactical setback. It was the moment Germany's last illusion shattered, the illusion that the Reich could still hold the line. What followed was not just military defeat, but psychological disintegration. The commanders were broken. The soldiers were scattered. The people were lost. And as the Allies poured through the opening, the heart of Germany lay exposed. By the end of March 1945, the breach at Reimagining had widened into an unstoppable flood. What began as a single bridgehead had grown into a front stretching over 40 kilometers. Town after town east of the Rhine fell in rapid succession. Linz, Neuwied, Andernach, Bonn, each captured with astonishing speed. The 1st U.S. Army advanced through the valleys of the Westerwald, breaking what little resistance remained. The German army, stripped of reserves and fuel, could do little but retreat or surrender. Commanders who once boasted of victory now found themselves leading phantom divisions, units that existed only on paper. The Allies pressed on relentlessly. Supply convoys rumbled across pontoon bridges day and night. The sound of truck engines replaced the sound of gunfire. In the towns along the Rhine, civilians emerged from basements dazed and trembling, watching columns of foreign troops roll through streets they had never imagined would fall. To them, the war's end felt both miraculous and unbearable, deliverance mixed with defeat. In the Ruhr Valley, the industrial heart of Germany, the Allies encircled nearly 400,000 German troops in what became known as the Ruhr Pocket. General Field Marshal Walter Model, the same commander who had once promised Hitler that he would defend the West to the last man, now found himself surrounded. Model's men fought fiercely for days, but the outcome was never in doubt. Cut off from supplies and air cover, entire divisions began surrendering by the thousands, roads clogged with prisoners. In fields and forests, white flags hung from rifles and window frames. On April 21st, Model, unwilling to face capture or execution, took his own life in a wooded area near Duisburg. His death symbolized the collapse of the German officer corps, proud, disciplined, but destroyed by a system that had demanded blind obedience over reason. Meanwhile, the Allies pushed deeper into the German heartland. Patton's Third Army thundered through Bavaria, seizing Frankfurt and Mainz. Bradley's forces rolled toward Kassel. Montgomery's armies swept through northern Germany toward Hamburg and the North Sea. The Elbe River became the next and final frontier. On April 25, 1945, American and Soviet forces met at Torgau, shaking hands over the shattered remains of the Third Reich. The crossing of the Rhine, once unthinkable, had set off the dominoes that led to this moment. But the victory came at a cost. The fighting east of the Rhine had been fast but brutal. German resistance, though fragmented, was still deadly. Allied casualty reports counted thousands killed and wounded in the final push. The collapse of the German front unleashed chaos, looting, civilian deaths, and the liberation of concentration camps that revealed horrors beyond comprehension. As Allied soldiers advanced, they encountered the full weight of what they were fighting against. At Buchenwald, Dachau, and Bergen-Belsen, they saw emaciated prisoners, piles of bodies, and the machinery of genocide. For many who had crossed the Rhine at Reimagining, the sight turned triumph into silence. The river they had fought to cross now felt like a boundary between ignorance and knowledge, between the war they thought they were fighting and the truth they had now seen. The Reimagining Bridge itself became a shrine of sorts. The collapsed girders were left where they fell, jutting from the Rhine like blackened bones. Soldiers who had crossed it returned after the war, standing on the riverbank in silence. Some brought wreaths, others brought tears. In the years that followed, the bridge's ruins were preserved as a memorial. The twin towers on either side still stand today, scarred but solid, holding exhibits that tell the story of those 10 days that changed history. The Germans rebuilt their nation around them. The Americans remembered them as the symbol of courage under fire, and historians would forever mark that crossing as the moment when World War II's end became inevitable. By the first week of May 1945, the Reich had ceased to exist. Berlin fell. Hitler was dead. The guns went silent, but the river still flowed. Cold, wide, eternal, carrying the memory of 1,000 men who crossed it under fire, and 1,000 more who never returned. The Rhine, once a wall, had become a bridge to peace, built not by politics, but by sacrifice. The Rhine had always been more than a river. It was a boundary between worlds, between nations, between victory and defeat, between the living and the lost. For centuries, it had guarded Germany like a silver sword cutting through its heart. In March 1945, that sword was broken. The crossing at Reimagining did more than alter maps. It revealed what war truly is. Not the grand strategies of generals, but the fragile chain of decisions made by tired men under impossible pressure. A bridge left standing by mistake. A lieutenant who refused to wait for orders. Engineers who built under fire. Soldiers who ran toward what every instinct told them to flee. History often turns on such moments, when chance meets courage, and chaos becomes destiny. For the German officers who watched in disbelief, the Rhine's fall was the end of an era. They had been raised to believe the river was sacred, that it would forever shield their homeland from invasion. Yet as the Americans crossed it overnight, they realized that Germany's future was no longer in their hands. For the Americans, the crossing was not triumph alone. It was a crossing into conscience. What awaited them beyond the river was not glory, but the shattered remnants of a nation and the revelation of crimes that defied comprehension. The Rhine, in its quiet flow, became a mirror, reflecting both the greatness and the grief of mankind. In the years that followed, the world rebuilt itself on the ashes of that spring. Bridges rose again across the Rhine, carrying travelers, not tanks. Where artillery once roared, vineyards grew, and where soldiers once bled, children now play. The towers of the Ludendorff Bridge still stand, silent witnesses to a night when the course of history turned beneath the moon. Every war ends somewhere. But few endings are as clear, as symbolic, or as inevitable as the moment the Rhine was crossed. It was the night when the impossible happened, when steel, will and fate aligned to topple an empire and bring a weary world one step closer to peace. The Rhine still flows, and in its current the echoes of Reimagining still whisper, of courage, of consequence, and of a bridge that changed the world forever. The German officers who witnessed the scene from afar could only watch in disbelief. Through binoculars, they saw endless lines of American armor moving across the river that was supposed to save them. The Rhine, Germany's ancient shield, had become a highway for their enemies. And as dawn broke over the water, the echoes of gunfire faded into the sound of construction, engineers hammering, trucks rumbling, soldiers shouting. The war had just shifted its balance. The crossing at Reimagining had not only changed tactics, it had changed destiny. The following days turned the miracle of Reimagining into a battle of endurance. The Ludendorff Bridge, half ruined yet defiant, became the most contested piece of steel in Europe. By dawn on March 8, 1945, American engineers were already working around the clock to stabilize the structure. The Germans had damaged several support girders in their failed demolition, and artillery shells had punched holes through the deck. Every vibration threatened to tear the bridge apart. But the men of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion refused to abandon it. They reinforced the beams with steel plates, laid fresh timbers, and patched every wound the river or the enemy inflicted. They worked waist-deep in icy water, dodging bullets and shrapnel, often under direct sniper fire. One engineer wrote in his diary, "We were fixing a bridge while the enemy tried to erase it from existence." But the Germans were not about to accept defeat. At dawn, the sky filled with the low drone of engines. From airfields deep inside Germany, Luftwaffe pilots scrambled for one of their last great missions, to destroy the bridge at Reimagining. Bombers, fighters, and even jet-powered Me-262s streaked toward the target. They attacked in waves day after day. Their bombs fell wide. Their rockets missed. The riverbank erupted in fountains of water and mud, but the bridge, battered and scorched, still stood. The Germans tried everything. They launched V-2 rockets from across the Rhine, the same terror weapons once used against London, but their aim was crude. None hit the bridge directly. They sent frogmen, trained demolition swimmers, down the river at night with mines strapped to their chests. American searchlights caught them in the current. Machine guns rattled and the water turned still again. The bridge had become a symbol of American defiance and German desperation. Meanwhile, the bridgehead on the eastern bank expanded relentlessly. By March 9th, the U.S. First Army had crossed more than 25,000 men, along with tanks, artillery, and trucks. The foothold grew larger each hour, spreading like a crack through Germany's western defenses. General Omar Bradley understood the significance immediately. "We've got a gold mine," he told Eisenhower. "We must hold it, no matter what." To protect it, the Allies threw everything they had into Reimagining. Anti-aircraft guns filled the riverbanks. Engineers built 2 pontoon bridges nearby to relieve pressure on the Ludendorff. The sky above the Rhine became a dome of flak bursts and tracer fire, but the Germans, though broken, still fought with fanatical resolve. Artillery from the east bank pounded the bridge endlessly. Mortar rounds fell like rain. Snipers targeted engineers as they worked. Each day, the bridge shook and screamed under the strain, a steel skeleton straining against time and war. By March 10th, the Germans unleashed their newest weapon, the Arado R-234, the world's first operational jet bomber. Its engines roared like thunder as it streaked over Reimagining at 700 kilometers per hour, dropping a single 1,000-kilogram bomb. The explosion threw men from their feet, but again, by miracle or fate, and the bridge survived. For the Allies, it was proof of endurance. For the Germans, it was a sign of doom. In Berlin, Hitler's rage reached fever pitch. He refused to believe the reports. He accused his generals of cowardice and treason. On March 9th, he issued orders for the execution of officers responsible for the bridge's loss. Within days, several were shot. Field Marshal Model sent desperate reports from the front. "The Americans now have a permanent bridgehead. We cannot remove them." But there were no reinforcements left. The Wehrmacht's last reserves were trapped on both sides of the river, fragmented, leaderless, exhausted. Then, on March 17th, 10 days after the crossing, the Ludendorff Bridge finally gave way. Engineers had warned that the structure could not bear the strain. Days of shelling, vibrations from traffic, and structural damage had taken their toll. At 3 p.m., as hundreds of soldiers crossed on foot, a loud metallic crack echoed through the valley. Witnesses saw the bridge ripple, as if alive, before the central span collapsed into the Rhine with a deafening roar. The river swallowed men, trucks, and steel alike. 28 Americans were killed, dozens more injured. It was the price of victory, paid even after the enemy's guns had begun to fade. But by then it no longer mattered. The Allies had already built 2 new pontoon bridges beside it. The foothold across the Rhine had grown too vast, too strong to dislodge. The German defense had failed completely. The bridge might have fallen, but the line had been crossed forever. When the dust cleared, the Rhine shimmered quietly once more. The wreckage of the Ludendorff Bridge jutted from the water like the bones of a dying giant. Smoke drifted over the valley, mingling with the morning mist. The men who survived stood in silence, knowing they had witnessed something that would be remembered long after they were gone. In those 10 days, the impossible had become inevitable. The Rhine, once the symbol of German invincibility, had been conquered by courage, improvisation, and chance. And as news spread across Europe, it changed everything, from the Allied battle plans to the morale of a collapsing Reich. The war in the West was no longer about if Germany would fall, only when. When reports of the Rhine crossing reached Berlin, the reaction was immediate and explosive. Inside the Führer bunker, officers stood silent as Adolf Hitler read the telegrams aloud. The words seemed unreal. American troops east of the Rhine at Reimagining. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the silence broke into fury. Witnesses later described Hitler's outburst as one of his worst in the final months of the war. He raged at his generals, pounding the table, veins standing out on his temples. "They have crossed the Rhine! The Rhine!" he shouted. You fools have betrayed me. The Rhine had always been sacred in his mind, a line no foreign army should ever cross. For centuries, it had been Germany's natural shield. To lose it meant losing the war, the nation, and the myth of invincibility he had built his empire upon. He blamed everyone, the Wehrmacht, the engineers, even the weather. Within hours, he demanded a reckoning. Orders went out to arrest every officer involved in the Remagen defense. Major Hans Scheller, Captain Willy Bratke, and several others were brought before a court-martial at Rheinbach. The verdict was predetermined. They were executed by firing squad, accused of cowardice and neglect. To the German soldiers still fighting, it was a terrifying signal. Their leader had lost touch with reality. For the Allied command, Reimagining was a triumph that carried both relief and caution. Eisenhower, while pleased with the success, warned against overconfidence. "We have a bridgehead," he said, "but not yet victory." He knew the Germans would fight desperately to defend the interior. Nevertheless, the news electrified Allied morale. Newspapers across America and Britain ran headlines proclaiming "Yanks cross the Rhine," and Germany's last barrier falls. For millions who had watched the war drag on since D-Day, Reimagining felt like the beginning of the end. At the front, soldiers sensed it too. The Rhine had been their horizon for months, a symbol of endurance in the war's final push. Crossing it changed everything. General Omar Bradley praised the men of the 9th Armored Division. They had the courage to seize an opportunity no one expected. General Eisenhower called it one of the war's boldest strokes. Yet the Allies knew that one bridge wasn't enough. They needed the entire Western Front to cross before Germany could regroup. Eisenhower ordered Patton and Montgomery to accelerate their own crossings. To the south, Patton's Third Army reached the Rhine near Oppenheim on March 22nd. True to his boast, Patton did more than cross, and he made a spectacle of it. Standing on the riverbank, he unzipped his fly and urinated into the water, declaring, "I told you I'd piss in the Rhine before it was over." Farther north, Montgomery's 21st Army Group prepared Operation Plunder, a massive assault near Wessel. On March 23rd, under the glare of searchlights and with hundreds of guns pounding the far bank, British and Canadian troops stormed across the river in a coordinated masterpiece of engineering and firepower. But none of these grand operations could overshadow what had already happened at Remagen. That crossing had caught the world's attention because it hadn't been planned. It was raw, spontaneous, and deeply human. It was war's unpredictability distilled into one moment. But at Reimagining, the true credit belonged to the men who acted without waiting for orders. Lieutenant Karl H. Timmerman, the first officer to lead troops across the Ludendorff Bridge, was a 24-year-old Nebraskan of German descent. He didn't have the luxury of strategy or hesitation. When he saw the bridge intact, he simply acted. It was leadership distilled to its purest form, a decision made in the span of seconds that changed the direction of an entire war. On the eastern bank, leadership looked very different. The German command structure by 1945 was a portrait of decay. Hitler's orders were absolute, irrational, and increasingly detached from reality. Every general who questioned him faced dismissal or death. When news reached Hitler that American forces had crossed the Rhine at Remagen, his rage was volcanic. Witnesses described him trembling with fury, veins bulging as he screamed accusations of betrayal. He could not accept that an intact bridge had fallen into enemy hands. He immediately ordered the court-martial and execution of officers responsible for Remagen's defense. General Major Richard von Bothmer, Major Hans Scheller, and Captain Willy Bratke were among those blamed, though many had simply been victims of chaos and poor communication. Within days, Hitler ordered them shot. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, newly appointed to command the Western Front, could only shake his head. The Wehrmacht had no reserves to throw at the Americans. Field Marshal Walter Model, overseeing Army Group B, struggled to rally his exhausted troops. His forces lacked ammunition, air cover, and fuel. Even the vaunted Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. When German aircraft finally attacked the Remagen bridgehead, they flew in small, desperate groups. Their bombs missed, their fuel ran dry, their losses were catastrophic. The German officers on the ground stood frozen, not in cowardice but in disbelief. The river they had been told was impenetrable had been breached overnight. The myth of the Rhine, the spiritual border of Germany, had been shattered in a single day. For the Allies, Remagen was a miracle. For the Germans, it was humiliation. But beneath the victory and despair lay something deeper, the moral weight of war's final chapter. As American forces poured across the Rhine, they entered a country broken from within. Villages lay in ruins, civilians starved. Refugees fled eastward to escape both Allied bombers and the approaching Red Army. The people of Remagen, mostly women, children, and the elderly, watched in silence as tanks rolled through their streets. Many were too numb to resist. Some wept at the sight of the stars and stripes fluttering above the bridge. For them, the war had brought nothing but death and ruin. The American soldiers, hardened by years of combat, faced a strange dissonance. They had fought through enemy territory before, but this was Germany itself. The faces in the windows were not those of soldiers. They were the faces of civilians, tired, defeated, human. For many, the crossing at Remagen marked the beginning of a moral reckoning. What had begun as liberation was now conquest. What had been a crusade for freedom was turning into occupation. The river they crossed wasn't just the Rhine. It was a line between vengeance and mercy, between ending the war and inheriting its consequences. Even in victory, the soldiers sensed the weight of what they were doing. They weren't just breaking through defenses. They were stepping into the ashes of an empire. As the smoke rose over the Ludendorff Bridge and the first trucks rolled into the German countryside, one thing was clear. The war in the West was entering its final act, but that act would not come easily. The Germans would not surrender quietly, and the Rhine would demand its price, in lives, in steel, and in fire. The crossing at Remagen was only the beginning of the end. The true climax was still to come, a moment of chaos, courage, and collapse when the river itself seemed to tremble under the weight of history. The morning of March 7, 1945, began like any other day in a war that refused to end. Gray clouds drifted low over the Rhine Valley. The distant rumble of artillery echoed across the hills. At Remagen, the Ludendorff Bridge stood over the river like a wounded giant, pocked with holes, girders bent, its steel blackened by smoke. It should not have still been standing, but it was. Shortly before noon, Lieutenant Karl Timmerman and his men from Company A, 27th Armored Infantry Battalion, approached the ridge overlooking the town. They were exhausted, mud-caked, and half-deaf from days of constant fighting. Through the haze, they spotted movement on the far bank. German trucks fleeing eastward, soldiers running across the bridge. The scene looked like a retreat, not a defense. Then came the realization the bridge was intact. At first, no one dared believe it. Reports had said every crossing was gone. Yet here, by sheer accident or providence, the last link across the Rhine remained standing. Timmerman radioed his superior, Major Murray Devers, with the news. Devers relayed it to General Hoge, who responded with disbelief. "Repeat that." "The bridge is what?" When confirmation came, Hoge didn't hesitate. His order was simple and unforgettable. Take it. Take it if you can. At 1:50 p.m., the first American tanks of Task Force Engemann rolled into Remagen. German defenders opened fire from the hills and towers, their bullets clattering off stone walls and tank armor. The town itself was chaos. Civilians fleeing, German engineers shouting orders, demolition cables snaking through doorways and rubble. At the bridge, Captain Willy Brach was trapped between orders and terror. His superiors had told him to hold the crossing until all retreating troops had passed, then destroy it. But the explosives were damp, the firing circuits faulty. He had already tried twice to detonate the charges. Both attempts had failed. At 2:00 p.m., as the first American shells slammed into Remagen, Bratke gave the desperate order, "Blow it now." A deafening explosion ripped through the structure. Smoke and debris filled the air. When it cleared, the bridge was still standing, damaged, sagging, but standing. The main charge had failed. The Rhine had refused to close. Brach knew what that meant. His defense had collapsed, and he would soon pay for it with his life. On the western bank, American soldiers realized what had happened. The bridge was still usable. They could cross, if they moved fast. Timmerman's men surged forward. Under a hail of machine gun fire, they sprinted onto the wooden planks. Bullets ricocheted off the steel beams. Shrapnel whined through the air. One soldier fell. Then another. But they kept running, driven by instinct, not orders. Engineers followed behind, cutting every visible wire they could find. Some dove into the river to remove floating mines. Others crawled across the bridge on their bellies, defusing charges with trembling hands. Halfway across, a German artillery round struck the bridge deck, blowing a hole through the planks. Men stumbled but kept going. The smell of burning wood and cordite filled the air. At 3 p.m., the first Americans reached the eastern bank. They stormed the bridge tower, throwing grenades through the windows. Inside, German defenders fought desperately, then surrendered. The stars and stripes were raised over the Rhine. It had taken just over an hour. News of the crossing spread through Allied headquarters like wildfire. Radio operators repeated the same words again and again as if confirming a miracle. American forces have crossed the Rhine at Reimagining. At 4 p.m., Eisenhower received the message. He stared at the map, at the thin blue line of the Rhine, and smiled faintly. "That's one hell of a break," he said. For the Germans, it was the opposite. A nightmare realized. In nearby command posts, officers stared at the same map in stunned silence. They had promised Berlin that the Rhine was secure, that no Allied soldier would set foot east of it. Now, in the space of a single afternoon, that illusion was gone. Field Marshal Walter Model, hearing the report, muttered only 2 words. Unthinkable, impossible. But it was already too late. The unthinkable had happened. As night fell, the Ludendorff Bridge groaned under the weight of history. Streams of soldiers and vehicles poured across its scarred frame. Searchlights swept the skies for German bombers. Engineers worked frantically to strengthen the structure, hammering steel plates into place while artillery fire thundered from the hills. On the far side, American units dug in, establishing a defensive perimeter in the town of Erpel. Mortar fire rained down from the ridges above, but the bridge had held. By midnight, more than 8,000 American troops had crossed. The U.S. Army had done what no one thought possible. They had crossed the Rhine, and they had done it in a single day. Lacked proper explosives and anti-tank weapons. The engineers placed charges along the structure, but they were old, damp, and unreliable. Behind him, hundreds of German soldiers, many wounded, many barely armed, were retreating across the bridge, desperate to escape the encircling Americans. The road was jammed with trucks, horse-drawn carts, and refugees. Bragg was trapped between orders and chaos. If he blew the bridge too early, he'd face execution. If too late, he'd hand Germany's last defense to the enemy. Meanwhile, on the opposite bank, the U.S. 9th Armored Division, part of Major General John W. Leonard's command, was pushing toward the river faster than anyone expected. Led by Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Engelmann and his combat command, they were ordered to secure the West Bank. Nothing more. Crossing the Rhine wasn't even on their objective list. But in war, fate often hides behind small decisions. As Engelmann's men rolled through the hills toward Remagen, they were surprised by the lack of resistance. Villages surrendered without a fight. German prisoners spoke of retreat, not defense. The closer they got to the river, the more they realized why something was wrong. By March 7th, the lead elements reached the high ground overlooking Remagen. Through the mist, they saw it. The Ludendorff Bridge still standing across the Rhine. Smoke curled from the far bank. The enemy was retreating, and the bridge was still intact. It was the kind of sight that defied belief. Back at divisional headquarters, the news was met with disbelief and hesitation. The Rhine was supposed to be destroyed, every crossing gone. But here, fate had left a door open into the heart of Germany. The decision that followed would be made in minutes, but its impact would echo for generations. Because once that door was opened, there would be no closing it again. For the men of the 9th Armored Division, the Rhine was more than a river, it was the finish line. They had fought through France, Luxembourg, and the frozen hell of the Ardennes. They had seen comrades fall in snow-choked forests and burned-out towns. When they reached the Rhine, they expected rest, not another battle. Yet as they gazed upon the Ludendorff Bridge, exhaustion gave way to adrenaline. The river shimmered like quicksilver under a dull sun. On the far bank lay Germany itself, the enemy's homeland, still defended, still dangerous. Private First Class Joe DeLigio, one of the first scouts to spot the bridge, later recalled, We couldn't believe it was still there. We thought it was a trap. Many shared that fear. The bridge could be rigged to explode at any moment. The wooden planks were blackened, the steel arches scarred from bombings. Every man who stepped onto it would be gambling with his life. Still, they advanced. Because to cross meant ending the war sooner, and maybe going home alive. For months, the soldiers had been told the Rhine was the last barrier. Crossing it meant entering the enemy's soul. That thought haunted them. They had seen what total war did to towns like Aachen and Cologne. They knew what awaited on the other side. Surrendering civilians, desperate defenders, and endless ruin, and yet they crossed, one trembling step at a time. From a tactical perspective, the events at Reimagining defied military logic. A river crossing under enemy fire without prior preparation was suicide by any textbook definition. Military academies taught that bridging the Rhine required weeks of engineering and artillery coordination. But here, chance had replaced planning. The 9th Armored Division's commander, General John W. Leonard, faced an impossible decision. His orders were to secure the western bank, not to cross it. The bridge could be trapped, the enemy could be waiting in ambush, or it could collapse under a single shell. Yet the temptation was overwhelming. Capturing a bridge across the Rhine could shorten the war. It was a strategic miracle no general could ignore. Leonard radioed higher command. The response from General William Hoge, commanding Combat Command B, was cautious but decisive. If you can seize it, seize it. Every minute mattered. The engineers raced forward, examining the bridge for explosives. Some of the charges were visible, hanging uselessly from snapped wires, others hidden beneath girders. German soldiers fired from the far bank, but their aim was frantic, scattered. The Americans moved fast. Infantry from Company A, 27th Armored Infantry Battalion, stormed the western tower. They fought room to room, clearing snipers and machine guns. Engineers followed, cutting wires, kicking live charges into the river. By 3 p.m., the impossible had become reality. The Americans were across. Tactically, the crossing at Reimagining created a shockwave through the entire Western Front. It provided the Allies an unexpected bridgehead east of the Rhine, bypassing months of planned operations. The crossing was both a tactical success and a logistical nightmare. The bridge was unstable, under constant artillery fire, and heavily congested with men and vehicles. But it held. And that was enough. In war, it's not just bravery that wins, it's engineering. The Rhine's width, up to 400 meters in some places, made it nearly impossible to cross without pontoon bridges, ferries, or amphibious craft. But in early March 1945, the U.S. Army's engineers proved that steel and ingenuity could outmatch fear and chaos. Once the Ludendorff Bridge was captured, combat engineers swarmed it day and night. They patched holes, reinforced beams, and fought fires from German artillery strikes. Every plank that splintered was replaced under fire. Every steel girder that shook from impact was braced with timber. The engineers also built pontoon bridges nearby, floating roadways made from aluminum boats lashed together and covered with planks. These makeshift crossings allowed tanks and supply trucks to reach the east bank. It was a triumph of improvisation under fire, but the bridge's capture also highlighted a darker technological truth. Germany's war machine was dying. Their demolitions had failed because the explosives were old, wet, and poorly maintained. Their artillery couldn't destroy the bridge because they lacked ammunition. Their air force couldn't strike effectively because the Luftwaffe was nearly extinct. Technology had once been Germany's greatest weapon. Now it betrayed them. For the Allies, technology became the key to momentum. Armored bulldozers, amphibious DUKW trucks, Bailey bridges, and mobile cranes turned the Rhine's banks into an industrial battlefield. Within days, engineers transformed a fragile foothold into a permanent gateway. Every steel bolt tightened, every plank nailed under fire, carried the echo of inevitability, the sound of a collapsing empire. As dawn broke over the Rhine, the bridge stood scarred but defiant. Smoke rose from the eastern bank, where German artillery continued to pound the crossing. Soldiers crouched in the open, clutching their helmets, whispering prayers as shells whistled overhead. They had no way of knowing that this single crossing would ignite panic across the entire German command, a panic that would soon reach Adolf Hitler himself. The next angle would not be about bridges or tactics. It would be about men, the leaders who gambled, the ones who froze, and the ones who broke. Leadership in war is not just about strategy. It's about instinct. And in March 1945, instinct split the Allied High Command. When word reached General Dwight D. Eisenhower that American troops had seized an intact bridge over the Rhine, his reaction was measured, calm, almost disbelieving. He had expected to cross weeks later, with carefully synchronized assaults by Montgomery in the north and Patton in the south. Now, by sheer chance, a small unit had opened the door into Germany's heart. Eisenhower's first thought was caution. He feared a trap, that the bridge might collapse or that the Germans would unleash a counterattack strong enough to wipe out the crossing force. But he also understood the symbolism. Crossing the Rhine would shatter the myth of German invincibility. So, he made a quiet decision. Reinforce the bridgehead? Hold it at any cost. General Omar Bradley, commanding the 12th Army Group, called it a gift from the gods. Patton, ever competitive, reportedly fumed when he heard the news. His rival had beaten him to Germany's frontier. Within days, Patton would rush his own troops to the river farther south, eager to carve his name into history. March 7, 1945. The night air hangs heavy over the Rhine. The river glows faintly under a bruised moon. Wide, dark, and ancient, it cuts through the heart of Germany like a scar. On the western bank, silence has an edge, the kind of silence that comes before history breaks. Far-off engines murmur. The faint clatter of steel tracks creeps closer, swallowed by the mist. American soldiers of the 9th Armored Division stand motionless, staring across the water toward the faint silhouette of the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen. It shouldn't be there. Every report said the Germans had destroyed all crossings. Yet, impossibly, this one still stands. Damaged, riddled with holes, but standing. A young lieutenant lowers his binoculars. His breath fogs in the cold night air. He doesn't speak. He doesn't need to. Everyone knows what this means. Across the river, German sentries are unaware. Inside their bunkers, they sip weak coffee and whisper about the inevitable. Berlin insists the Rhine will hold, that no one can cross it alive. In the next hour, that belief will die. And when the Germans look out from the eastern bank, they will stand frozen, unable to believe what they are seeing. By early 1945, the map of Europe was bleeding. To the west, the Allies had broken through France, liberated Belgium, and crossed into the Netherlands. To the east, the Red Army was storming through Poland, its artillery already echoing near the Oder River, less than 70 kilometers from Berlin. Germany was collapsing, but not yet defeated. Adolf Hitler's armies were retreating, but the retreat was controlled, brutal, methodical, and drenched in denial. He had ordered his generals to fight to the last man, to turn every village into a fortress. His hope was that the Allies would break themselves against the natural defenses of Germany, and none was greater than the Rhine. The Rhine was more than a river. It was a legend, a symbol of German pride, a frontier of culture and defense stretching from the Alps to the North Sea. For centuries, it had divided empires and armies. In 1945, it became the Third Reich's final wall. Behind it lay the industrial heart of Germany, the Ruhr Valley, a labyrinth of steel, coal, and factories that still fed the Nazi war machine. For the Allied commanders, the Rhine was the last great obstacle before victory. Every soldier who looked eastward knew it. Once they crossed that river, there would be no turning back. The invasion of Germany proper would begin, and the end of the war would be measured in weeks, not months. But the Rhine was wide, treacherous, lined with steep banks and fortified towns. The German army, though battered, had withdrawn to this line, determined to make a final stand. The remnants of divisions, Volksgrenadiers, SS units, Luftwaffe field troops, and teenage conscripts were thrown together to hold every crossing, every bridge, every inch of riverbank. Hitler himself had declared, "The Rhine is Germany's destiny. No enemy shall cross it." But destiny was slipping through his fingers. The winter of 1944-45 had drained Germany's strength. The failed Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, had shattered Hitler's last hope for negotiation. The offensive cost the Germans nearly 100,000 men, thousands of tanks, and much of their remaining fuel. What had been envisioned as a decisive blow against the Allies ended in disaster. By February, The Allies were advancing faster than even their generals anticipated. General Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group and Field Marshal Montgomery's 21st Army Group were pressing toward the Rhine from multiple directions. American, British, Canadian, and French divisions were converging in a vast pincer. The Germans fought savagely in every village, delaying the inevitable. Cities like Aachen and Cologne were turned into rubble-strewn battlefields. Allied bombers filled the skies day and night, targeting bridges, railways, and supply depots. The once mighty Luftwaffe could barely lift a handful of planes in response. By late February, the Rhine became a line not just of defense, but of fear. German officers whispered among themselves, would the Americans stop here? Many believed the Allies would pause to regroup, rebuild bridges, and prepare massive river crossing operations that could take weeks. The river's breadth, fast current, and destroyed crossings made it seem impossible for any army to cross swiftly. In Berlin, Hitler's map room pulsed with red lights marking lost ground. The Führer raged at his generals, demanding counterattacks that no longer existed. He replaced commanders weekly. Rundstedt, Model, and Kesselring all received impossible orders. Meanwhile, across the Rhine, the Allies were debating strategy. Eisenhower, cautious and deliberate, planned to cross the river with overwhelming strength using coordinated assaults from north to south. His plan emphasized logistics, not heroics. The methodical crushing of Germany rather than risky glory. But not all his commanders agreed. General George S. Patton, ever impatient, boasted that he'd piss in the Rhine before the war was over. His Third Army raced across the Saar and Moselle rivers, seeking weak points. To the north, Montgomery prepared a massive assault near Wesel, relying on engineering precision and air dominance. The Rhine crossings were coming, but they were meant to be planned, deliberate, and overwhelming. No one expected an accidental crossing. No one imagined a small American force would seize an intact bridge in the heart of Germany before the main assault even began. And yet, that's exactly what fate was arranging. In a quiet town called Reimagining, south of Bonn, the ancient Ludendorff Bridge still spanned the Rhine, battered by bombs, abandoned by engineers, and overlooked by German command. A single mistake, a single delay in demolition would change the course of the war, and within days that mistake would become legend. The Rhine was meant to be uncrossable. By the start of March 1945, Hitler's engineers had already destroyed most of the great bridges that spanned it: Cologne, Koblenz, Mainz, Mannheim, all reduced to twisted iron and smoke. Each demolition had been ordered in panic and pride. Better to destroy their own country's arteries than let the Allies cross them. But one bridge escaped destruction. It was the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, a relic from the First World War. Built in 1916, it was named after General Erich Ludendorff, one of Germany's great war leaders. Two massive stone towers anchored its ends, and beneath its steel arches ran twin railway tracks strong enough to carry tanks. By 1945, its timbers were rotting, and its structure scarred from bombings. It was no longer of strategic importance, at least so the German High Command believed. Remagen itself was a quiet riverside town, nestled between hills and forests. It held little tactical significance compared to the industrial north, yet it would soon become the single most important point in Germany's western defense. On the western bank, General Courtney Hodge's 1st U.S. Army was advancing rapidly. After breaking through the Eifel region, American forces were exhausted but relentless. Every day brought a new town, another surrender, another bridge blown to rubble just as they arrived. The Germans were retreating faster than expected, their defensive lines disintegrating under air attacks and artillery barrages. Still, no one believed they would reach the Rhine before mid-March. The plan called for deliberate crossings weeks later. But war rarely obeys plans. Eisenhower's overall strategy, called Operation Lumberjack, was simple in theory. Drive the Germans back to the Rhine, seize the western bank, and destroy as many enemy forces as possible before attempting any crossings. His focus was to capture or destroy every bridge to trap retreating German units east of the river. But the speed of the advance made communication difficult. Some bridges were destroyed late, some too soon, and others, like Remagen, not at all. On the German side, confusion reigned. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group B, had too few men to cover too much ground. He knew that the defense of the Rhine was impossible with his shattered divisions. The Wehrmacht was no longer an organized army. It was a collection of fragments, retreating under ceaseless pressure. Model warned Berlin repeatedly. Bridges like Remagen needed to be blown immediately, or the enemy would cross. But Hitler refused. He demanded that every bridge remain intact until the last German soldier had crossed, then be destroyed on command. At the perfect moment, that perfect moment never came. At Reimagining, the demolition teams were led by Captain Willy Bratje, a disciplined but exhausted officer with few resources. He had been ordered to hold the bridge at all costs, even though he